Europeanization beyond the EU, EU external governance, and how does the EU impact on non-member states' democracy promotion in the European neighborhood?
Thank you very much for the generous introduction, and thanks to you for coming to my lecture today, which will indeed be on Europeanization beyond the EU. It's a bit of a follow-up project. I've done in the past some work on the Europeanization of candidate countries for the European Union, together with Uli Sedelmeier and other people. And since enlargement is over now, and it's very unlikely that there's much more to happen in terms of enlargement in the near future, we've actually started to look a little bit beyond the candidate countries and see basically how far this Europeanization idea and process travels beyond the EU and its candidate countries. I argue there are three major reasons for people to look beyond the EU for Europeanization. One is that with the creation of the single market, by creating such a large market, some people speak of the largest single market on the globe, it was expected that such a large market would also have external effects that economists describe, for instance, as trade diversion or external governance effects. So that was one reason for suspecting that European integration might go beyond the actual member states. The other one is the one that I already mentioned, had to do with Eastern enlargement. The run-up to Eastern enlargement, the 10 years before the new member states actually joined, were a period of rather unprecedented intrusion into the legislation, institution building of the transition countries. Very strong effects that we could observe there. Plus, the EU in this time period has set up a number of novel arrangements, institutional arrangements, for neighboring non-candidates, like the European Economic Area for Norway, Iceland, Liechtenstein, and more recently the European Neighborhood Policy, where we would also expect to see an institutionalized impact of European integration, of European rules, without membership. So the idea is, under what conditions can the EU have an effect, regulatory, institutional effect on policies, politics, institutions in non-member countries. The everyday impact that the EU has on other countries has much more to do with its issue-specific rules in very specific policy areas, and here the literature needs to be developed also much more. So my bottom line here is basically that in order to better understand Europeanization and external relations beyond the EU, we would need a much more disaggregated analysis, at least at first, to give us a much better empirical picture of what the EU does. Then maybe, if possible, we can aggregate it again, but starting with this highly aggregate abstract level certainly misses much of what is going on. And now if we combine the two, we get basically four mechanisms of Europeanization. The one that is best known and best studied is conditionality, which is a direct impact based on cost-benefit calculations, or the manipulation of cost-benefit calculations. We have externalization, which is an indirect impact based on the logic of consequences, where basically the existence of the EU and its markets forces third countries to adapt their economic and other policies to the EU's presence. We have socialization, which is a direct attempt of the European Union to disseminate its beliefs, its values, its norms by changing preferences of other countries. And we have imitation, which is again the indirect counterpart, meaning that actors outside the EU see the EU as some kind of model for integration, for development that they follow, without the EU really making a strong effort to change the preferences of these actors. What I listed below that here are a number of conditions that are usually associated with these mechanisms. These are the conditions under which these mechanisms work. I do not have the time to really go through them in detail, but conditionality depends on the size and credibility of the incentives that the EU can offer, and also on the costs of compliance for the third countries. Externalization has been described to depend on first the market size of the European Union, we could also call it market relevance for third countries, and on legalization and centralization of rules. And the conditions for socialization and imitation are quite similar, taken from the literature on international socialization. So these mechanisms will work best if third actors are new to the international system or have an uncertain position in the international system and therefore seek for guidance or models in the international system. It works best when the authority or the legitimacy of the EU are considered to be high, when actors identify with the European Union, and if the rules of the European Union resonate with the political traditions, legal traditions of these countries. And it also depends on the frequency and density of intergovernmental, transgovernmental, transnational contacts between the EU and these third countries. Enlargement or the Europeanization of candidate countries has always been described as the most successful foreign policy that the EU has ever had. The question for the EU as a foreign policy actor is, of course, can it really act in a similarly strong way if the conditions that we have in the candidate countries cannot be found beyond the candidate countries. Now, the first group of countries to look at are what I would call the quasi-member countries. Here again, we have a similarly strong and asymmetric economic dependence as for the candidate countries. We also have basically strong membership incentives. If it was only the decision of the European Union, these countries would be members today. Speaking of Norway, speaking of Switzerland, these are countries that the EU would actually like to have very much as members. Yeah, they are rather small, they are democratic, they are rich. That's the ideal member state that the EU looks for. But these countries are not members because in these countries you have strong popular Euroscepticism and what I would call an affordable identity. Yeah, that they have their own strong national identity, but in contrast to other countries, they can really afford to have that because they are rich enough to play around with their own national identities, which some other countries just cannot do. Now that we move on to let's say the larger OECD world, and probably New Zealand would be part of that, we see that basically there's no direct impact of the EU anymore. There are no overarching institutional arrangements through which the EU tries to have a direct impact on these countries. There's basically no design for exporting EU rules. But still, under specific conditions, this rule export works. And of course, let's say the interdependence with the EU market also diminishes quickly as you basically move out of Europe, and other trading partners become much more important than the European Union.